And now we can hear from Her Majesty the Queen, who has recorded a special broadcast as part of the commemorations to mark the 75th anniversary of VE Day.
This is London. His Majesty King George VI.
Let us remember the men in all the services, and the women in all of the services who have laid down their lives. We have come to the end of our tribulation, and they are not with us at the moment of our rejoicing.
I speak to you today at the same hour as my father did exactly 75 years ago. His message then was a salute to the men and women at home and abroad who had sacrificed so much in pursuit of what he rightly called a great deliverance. The war had been a total war. It had affected everyone, and no one was immune from its impact. Whether it be the men and women called up to serve, families separated from each other, or people asked to take up new roles and skills to support the war effort, all had a part to play. At the start, the outlook seemed bleak, the end distant, the outcome uncertain. But we kept faith that the cause was right. And this belief, as my father noted in his broadcast, carried us through. Never give up, never despair. That was the message of VE Day. I vividly remember the jubilant scenes my sister and I witnessed with our parents and Winston Churchill from the balcony of Buckingham Palace. The sense of joy in the crowds who gathered outside and across the country was profound. Though while we celebrated the victory in Europe, we knew there would be further sacrifice. It was not until August that fighting in the Far East ceased and the war finally ended. Many people laid down their lives in that terrible conflict. They fought so we could live in peace, at home and abroad. They died so we could live as free people in a world of free nations. They risked all so our families and neighborhoods could be safe. We should and will remember them. As I now reflect on my father's words and the joyous celebrations which some of us experienced firsthand, I'm thankful for the strength and courage that the United Kingdom, the Commonwealth, and all our allies displayed. The wartime generation knew that the best way to honor those who did not come back from the war was to ensure that it didn't happen again. The greatest tribute to their sacrifice is that countries who were once sworn enemies are now friends, working side by side for the peace, health, and prosperity of us all. Today, it may seem hard that we cannot mark this special anniversary as we would wish. Instead, we remember from our homes and our doorsteps. But our streets are not empty. They are filled with the love and the care that we have for each other. And when I look at our country today and see what we are willing to do to protect and support one another, I say with pride that we are still a nation those brave soldiers, sailors, and airmen would recognize and admire. I send my warmest good wishes to you all.
was a nationwide sing-along to the wartime favourite We'll Meet Again, the song made so popular by Force's sweetheart, Dame Vera Lynn. Events have been taking place throughout the day to commemorate the 75th anniversary of VE Day. A 2-minute silence was held at 11 o'clock this morning to mark the day in 1945 when Britain and its allies accepted the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany, bringing the war in Europe to an end. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell reports.
In streets largely deserted due to the lockdown, Britain remembered and gave thanks for the day when the Second World War in Europe came to an end. The nation's tribute was led by the Prince of Wales with the Duchess of Cornwall at the War Memorial on the Balmoral estate. A cannon at Edinburgh Castle marked the start of the 2-minute silence and carefully managed moments of remembrance across the nation. At Balmoral, as the silence ended, the Prince of Wales laid his wreath in tribute to the Second World War generation which overcame the tyranny of Nazi Germany. The cost had been high. Nearly 400,000 members of Britain's armed services lost their lives in the Second World War, and a further 60,000 civilians. Over the White Cliffs near Dover, 2 Spitfires, the wartime fighter aircraft which played such a key role in the defence of Britain, flying today in remembrance of the few, linking the communities over which they flew with the events of 75 years ago, as today's political leaders paid tribute to the wartime generation.
All of us who were born since 1945 are acutely conscious that we owe everything we most value to the generation who won the Second World War.
We remember the millions of people from across the United Kingdom and from across the world who came together in World War II to fight for our shared values. Values of freedom, of democracy, of peace.
On this day in 1945, many tens of thousands of people took to the streets in joyous celebration that the war in Europe was over. At 3 o'clock, they heard a broadcast by Prime Minister Winston Churchill.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and of Grand Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe. Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May.
At Buckingham Palace that evening, Churchill appeared on the balcony with the King and Queen and their daughters Elizabeth and Margaret. Later, the 2 princesses left the palace to join the crowds, as Elizabeth recalled in a broadcast in 1985, reissued today by the palace.
We cheered the King and Queen on the balcony and then walked miles through the streets. I remember lines of unknown people linking arms and walking down Whitehall, all of us just swept along on a tide of happiness and relief.
The contrast between the crowded streets of May 1945 and those same streets today is striking. Yet, 75 years after the end of the Second World War, a nation in lockdown looked beyond its present challenges to give thanks. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News.
Victoria Howard is a royal historian. She joins me now. We've all just watched the Queen's message. She linked VE Day with today's pandemic, saying at the end, "I say with pride, we are still a nation those brave soldiers, sailors and airmen would recognise and admire."
Yes, and I think there's definitely been this link comparing this current pandemic with the Second World War that seems to have really resonated with the British people, that it's a struggle that actually we don't know how this is going to end. But that's something the Queen is really, really good at, finding that message of unity, particularly as a non-political figure, to try and bring a bit of a morale boost to her people.
And of course, she is herself a veteran of World War II.
Yeah, exactly. In 1944, she joined the ATS at the age of 18. She trained as a mechanic and she learnt to drive trucks and ambulances. And that's something she's very, very proud of. She's actually the only head of state that we now have in the world to have served in the Second World War. So it really does mean something for her to talk to her soldiers, her seamen, to actually think about this really historic event and commemorate it in an important and special way. What stood out to you in her speech? I think very much the setup and the reference to George VI, her father. You'll notice there were two photos in that video. One was of her father, George VI, on the front at her desk. Slightly behind her was one of the royal family on the balcony with Churchill on VE Day, waving at the crowds, sharing in those celebrations. And this is also this is always something the monarchy does, drawing on those traditions, reminding people of the continuity and security that the royal family can bring. So it began with some of George VI's words, and then we heard the Queen reference them and talk about her own foray into the London crowds that night. There's a great paradox here. The Queen is not physically able to get out and about around the country, but we're hearing from her more than we ever do. Yes, that's very true. And I think that goes to show the emphasis that, one, the government is placing on the Queen as this uniting figure, but two, the involvement that the Queen wants to have in such a national crisis, essentially, because that is where the royals come into their own. As I said, this driving figure of unity that really can rally people in a way that politicians just can't. So I think this is very deliberate. It's the Queen trying to show that message of security, that actually, we can get through this because people trust what she says. Victoria Howard, thank you so much. Thank you. 20.5 million Americans lost their jobs last month as the coronavirus pandemic paralysed the economy. The US unemployment rate for April soared to 14.7%. That's the highest since the Great Depression. The true economic damage may be even worse, as the numbers don't include workers whose hours have been cut or those unable to look for work because of stay-at-home orders. The monthly job figures shown here since the 2008 financial crash showed just how quickly and dramatically the US labour market has collapsed. In the space of just a few weeks, the economy has shed more jobs than were lost in the whole of the last recession. Let's speak now to Samira Hussain, our business correspondent in New York. Samira, we're looking at comparisons which go back to the Great Depression in the 30s. That really means, in practical terms, almost nobody alive has any experience or memory of just how bad this is.
Indeed, but remember that what makes this really different than any other massive amounts of job losses that we've ever seen is the speed with which all of these jobs were lost. Remember that just 2 months ago, the unemployment rate in the United States was 3.5%. That's a 50-year low. And fast forward 2 months, and now we're seeing that the unemployment rate is 14.7%. And the real sort of number, actually, as what you alluded to, the fact that it's not taking into account people that are working less hours, that are not even looking for a job anymore. If you take into account those number of people, the unemployment rate is more like 20%.
It looks like those graphs in some ways just simply cannot cope. You almost think it's a computer glitch, the way the line just sort of skyrockets downwards or upwards. What kind of steps are being taken by the government to try to get this back to, if not normal, then survivable?
Well, look, the government has put through all kinds of massive spending measures to try and help the American people weather this storm. And I think you need to look at specifically the jobs, or the sectors rather, that are being impacted. Look, across the board, every single sector in the American economy is experiencing job losses. But by far the biggest losses are being experienced by people in the services sector. So in hospitality and leisure, we saw that 7.7 million people have lost their job in that small sector itself. That represents like 27%. It's massive. But what a lot of people believe is that, look, if you reopen the economy, then these jobs could potentially come back quite quickly, because we're talking about bars and restaurants and retail stores. The trouble is that it's showing that perhaps we might be starting to see other job losses in other sectors. And if that happens, we're probably going to see a much longer and a much more difficult recovery.
Is there pressure from some states to open up regardless of the state of the pandemic?
Absolutely. There are certainly many states in the United States that are engaged in different levels of reopening their economies. Some are doing so faster than others, and there's a lot of worry from health experts that this is perhaps happening too fast, and most crucially, it could spur a second wave of this pandemic. And if a second wave were to happen, that would be even more dramatic and even more catastrophic for the American economy.
Samira Hussain, thank you so much. Spain is slowly starting to open up after one of the tightest lockdowns in Europe. People can now leave their homes to exercise outdoors, and small businesses have been allowed to serve customers again. But there are still strict rules, including compulsory use of masks on public transport, hygiene procedures in shops, and social distancing. There are concerns that some are not following the regulations, increasing the risk of infection. Our Europe correspondent Damian Grammaticus reports from Madrid.
This is the country cranking into motion again, but cautiously, keeping their distance. Rush hour without the rush, and everyone is masked. It's compulsory now on public transport, even while stations are mostly empty.
Today is the first day I leave home and I go to work. I am afraid. You don't know what might happen. You may catch the virus.
Masks are handed out to anyone who doesn't have them. Marilyn isn't taking any chances.
This is really uncomfortable. You can't breathe easily, but for my protection, I need it.
Most people in Spain are still confined within inside their houses, so this limited opening brings risks. Among them, as people come out, they'll start to behave in a way that enables the virus to begin to spread again.
A street party on the first day the lockdown was lifted was exactly what the authorities feared. Those who took part are being fined €1,000 each. So police move people on. And as businesses open, distancing is enforced rigorously with safety tape and screens. Or visors and limits, one customer in the shop at a time. The first visit to the hairdresser means a friendly greeting, but feet must be disinfected. Hands cleaned, and more gloves and masks. All by government order. This is a high-risk place.
Risk? Yes, there is. Until we have a vaccine, everybody is at risk. I hope for the best.
Then the place is swabbed down before a new customer is allowed in. But getting people to maintain a safe separation is a problem. As the rules relax, the numbers outside are growing, and not everyone keeps their distance.
What I don't like is that not all the people is very aware of what the situation is, and I think they don't really respect the rules, the basic rules that we should have.
I mean, there's a lot of people, but yeah, I think we try to keep it clean,
as safe as possible.
Yeah, as safe as possible, yes.
So underneath the surface, there's real nervousness, even as Spain starts to relax and embrace its newfound freedoms.
The First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, is urging people to stay home this bank holiday weekend and has said it would be catastrophic to lift the lockdown too soon. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is going to make a statement on Sunday night outlining how he sees the lockdown easing over the coming weeks. But Downing Street has tried to dampen expectations of any great changes. Our political correspondent Ben Wright reports.
A sunny May bank holiday doesn't normally look like this. But of course, these are not normal times, and the lockdown restrictions are being continued in all 4 nations of the UK. On Sunday, the Prime Minister will map out how the country might gradually ease out of its confinement. But today, Number 10 said any new measures would be very limited.
Today, the Welsh Government has announced some modest changes to their lockdown rules before the Prime Minister speaks on Sunday. Can we expect those measures to be mirrored in England? And what can you as the UK government do to ensure the public receive a very clear message?
We have to be realistic that there isn't going to be any dramatic overnight change. We will be very, very cautious as we loosen the restrictions we have. As the data that we're outlining on a daily basis shows, we are not out of the woods. There are still major challenges with this virus.
But the government's been accused of allowing mixed messages to develop after Boris Johnson told the Commons on Wednesday some rules could change from next week.
We'll want, if we possibly can, to get going with some of these measures on Monday.
There followed newspaper headlines suggesting a more significant loosening of the rules. We do know Number 10 plans to scrap the stay at home slogan after this weekend, but it's now clear any changes will be small. The 4 nations of the UK can set their own rules, but have so far largely moved in lockstep. That may be beginning to change.
I, with the First Ministers of Wales and Northern Ireland, spoke to the Prime Minister. There was, I think, a helpful recognition in that call that the 4 UK nations may well move at different speeds if our data about the spread of the virus says that that is necessary to suppress it.
Scotland's First Minister said she might consider a minor rule change around exercise, and similar adjustments are being pondered in Northern Ireland.
I would put going out more for exercise in the open air as a nuanced change rather than a fundamental change. So I think that those things can be looked at during the 3 weeks.
Social distancing is set to last for a long time yet, as politicians across the UK try and balance the need to restore some sort of normality to our home and working lives without triggering a second big wave of the virus. Ben Wright, BBC News.
Ben explains whether the 4 nations of the UK will remain aligned in their lockdown measures.
They are responsible for their own lockdown restrictions and rules. Yes, I mean, the general direction is sort of set by the UK government. I mean, that's what Boris Johnson is trying to do. And Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland and Mark Drakeford in Wales have talked about wanting a harmonious UK-wide approach. But of course, for years in the UK, we've had significant devolution of powers to the constituent nations of the United Kingdom. And so in Scotland, they have control over their own education system, their own healthcare system, housing, some financial measures. And even though so far during this lockdown, we've seen almost complete alignment between the nations of the UK, I think you're beginning to see the potential, at least, for that to start to soften a bit as the leaders of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland look at their own transmission rates of this virus and work out what is in our own best interests here. And I think there was a bit of a lot of concern, actually, particularly in Scotland a few days ago when they looked at the British press previewing what looked like a significant relaxing of rules when the Prime Minister makes his announcement on Sunday. That's not going to happen now, by all accounts. I mean, it's clear that I think any changes will be very modest, in line, I imagine, with the sort of things that we heard from Mark Drakeford in Wales today. A bit more exercise, recycling centres opening, libraries possibly reopening, garden centres, things like that. But I think they're going to try as much as possible to keep the 4 nations aligned.
Ben Wright. A father and son have been arrested and charged in the US state of Georgia for the fatal shooting of an unarmed black man. Gregory McMichael and Travis McMichael were detained on Thursday by the State Bureau of Investigation. Both were charged with murder and aggravated assault. Ahmaud Arbery had been jogging in February when he was confronted by the pair. For more than 2 months, the police did not charge the McMichaels. But in the last few days, a video appearing to show the killing emerged and has widely been circulated. It caused outrage over the failure of the police to take action against the 2 men. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation said that both men had been taken into custody shortly after their agents became involved.
I can tell you that based on our involvement in this case, considering the fact that we were hit the ground running Wednesday morning, and within 36 hours we had secured warrants for 2 individuals for felony murder, I think that speaks volumes for itself, and that the probable cause was clear to our agents pretty quickly. We realize that emotions have run very high here for a period of time, and still are to a great extent, and we understand that and we respect that.
Events have been taking place throughout the day to mark the 75th anniversary of VE Day. A 2-minute silence was held at 11 o'clock in the morning to mark the day in which Britain and its allies accepted the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. And in a message, the Queen has said, "We are still a nation that those brave soldiers would recognise and admire." You're watching BBC News.